Good morning to you. The government, we are told, thinks the British public is misbehaving. We aren't doing enough to stop this second wave. Well, if that's true, apart from shouting louder, what more can ministers do now? Derbyshire police have been collaring walkers carrying cups of peppermint tea in their hands. But to impose tougher measures across the whole country now, when everybody is already so fed up, well, that could be a risky step. And anyway, isn't this disobedience partly the result of months of mixed messages from ministers? Well, I'll be speaking this morning to the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, and to Professor Peter Horby, Chair of NervTag, the government's virus advisory group. Plus, in the second of my New Year Leaders interviews, I'll be talking about the pandemic and much else with the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. And as the BBC throws aside quiz shows to help teach children kept away from school, I'm joined by one of its best-loved educators, the physicist Brian Cox. Before them, we will be surveying today's news with the BBC's political correspondent who specialises in life beyond Westminster, Alex Forsyth, and with the editor of the Daily Mirror, Alison Phillips. But let's begin with the news from Roger Johnson.
Andrew, thank you. Good morning. Rapid testing for people without coronavirus symptoms will be made available across England this week. The government says that people who cannot work from home during the lockdown should be prioritised. The scheme will use lateral flow tests, which can return results in 30 minutes. The Home Secretary has defended the way that police have handed out fines during the lockdown, saying that there is a need for strong enforcement. Priti Patel said the number of cases and deaths recorded last week means that officers are right to stop giving repeated warnings to those who breach the rules. The Indonesian Navy has recovered pieces of a Boeing 737 aircraft which crashed a few minutes after taking off yesterday. 62 people were on board. The plane fell more than 3,000 metres in less than a minute before disappearing from radar screens. 10 ships and 4 aircraft have been involved in the recovery operation. The US authorities have made more than 80 arrests following the storming of the Capitol building in Washington on Wednesday. Democrats have accused President Trump of inciting the violence and say that they will begin impeachment proceedings against him tomorrow. And council tax increases due in April should be scrapped to ease the pressure on family budgets. That's according to the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer. Writing in the Sunday Telegraph today, he calls the increases absurd and says that government should give councils the support they need. Local authorities in England will be able to raise council tax by up to 5% from April. That's it from me. Next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Now back to you, Andrew.
Many thanks for that. And as ever, to the front pages of the paper, where you see many of those same stories reflected. There's the Sunday Times with an interview with Chris Whitty. Hospitals face the worst crisis in living memory is the cheerful headline. Police to issue fines after one warning. Again, you heard that kind of story in the news just now. And the Queen, of course, and the Duke of Edinburgh have received vaccinations. They're on a lot of front pages. A shot in the arm, says the Sunday Mirror about that. The Observer has a story, doctors raising the alarm, they say, as COVID strikes down the NHS workforce, problems inside hospitals. There's the Sunday Express, the Queen and the Duke lead the way, they say, in vaccinations. And finally, the Mail on Sunday, the Queen launches Britain's jab blitz. She's got a huge amount of publicity, not surprisingly. Now, I'm joined by Alex Forsyth, as I said, and by Alison Phillips. Welcome to you both. Alex, first of all, the Sunday Times story here. They've got a couple of really quite interesting interviews with government scientists, haven't they?
Yeah, well, the papers are wall-to-wall, really, today, talking about the COVID crisis, because we know the numbers are pretty staggering at this point, and I think there's a real fear in number 10 about the direction that things are heading in and the sense that they're going to get a lot worse before they get better. So we're hearing a lot from the front line in hospitals. And it's worth pointing out that a lot of this at the moment seems to be focused on London and London hospitals, where we know a major incident was declared this week, where the figures figures are really quite bad, where infection rates are higher than other parts of the country. But Downing Street...
You're a non-metropolitan correspondent, so is it spreading across the rest of the country?
It is. And Number 10, I think, are trying to get that message out there. This isn't a London problem at this point. It's worth reflecting, though, that while that is the case right now, that this new variant is more transmissible and spreading across the country, there are points in this pandemic where there have been real geographical divides. If you think back to the summer and the autumn, where, you know, the parts of the northwest and the Midlands were still in lockdown, living under restrictions, and other parts of the country, notably the south,
there was
were
the great
opening up.
Manchester-London row going on for quite a long time.
Yeah, and the political danger for the government is that exacerbates the very regional divides that it's promised to address. And I think that in the long term, that politically, that really is making that challenge more difficult for the Prime Minister.
Alison, you've got a big spread in the Sunday Mirror, Shut It All Down, where you're looking at what more the government could now be doing to control this at a very dangerous moment.
Yes, I mean, there's certainly a sense that this lockdown isn't the same as where we were sort of last March and April time. And there's Anthony Costello, the Professor of Global Health at UCL, is saying that we need a total clampdown. He said no nurseries, which are still open, no synagogues, no churches, no mosques. We should have compulsory masks in outdoor spaces, and back to the 2 meters of social distancing. We're also seeing that lots of schools have got far more key worker children in them than we had in the first lockdown. And I think that's twofold, because it's partially the sense that there is still those opportunities for the virus to be transmitted, but it's also this wider sense that it's not quite the same as it was last spring, and therefore, result, people aren't perhaps following it quite so ruthlessly as they did last spring.
So this is a moment when all the political parties, including the Labour Party, have some tricky decisions to make. And Alex, this is not just about the government. When it comes to the red wall seats, both parties are fighting for those votes. Both parties have got their agendas there.
Quite right. And we've got a really interesting op-ed today from Keir Starmer, obviously Labour leader. And he's chosen the Sunday Telegraph to write in, which is interesting in and of itself, given that he is, of course, the Labour leader, perhaps not the traditional paper you might expect him to go for. But his pitch really is for the family. What he's saying is that, bear in mind, he's supported the latest lockdown measures. I think Labour's trying to draw a dividing line when it comes to the support packages that the government's putting out there. His big push today is about families, and what Keir Starmer is arguing for is that the government was wrong to say that councils could put up council tax this year to try and draw in some extra funds, because that could hit some of the people that are really struggling financially as a result of the pandemic. So that's Sir Keir Starmer's argument, and I think we're probably going to hear a bit more from him this week around that. It's worth saying that I know that some local authorities are actually not going to use that extra 5% leeway, because we've got some pretty important local elections coming up in May in England, and politically it might be not the most astute thing for them to do, to hike council tax.
So those local elections, is it likely they're all going to go ahead? Because presumably there's really big practical difficulties with holding elections, successful elections, in the middle of a pandemic, if it's still rolling by then.
Yeah, there are some very active conversations happening about that. And while they're local elections in England, they are very significant local elections to local authorities, and there are mayoral elections too, and they take in the votes that were put off from last year. And there are also very significant elections to the Welsh and Scottish parliaments, which are due to happen in May. So some very active discussions. The worry is that polling stations won't be practical with social distancing, that it might just not be safe to have them take place.
So Alex, in terms of the Scottish elections, which are going to be a huge UK-wide moment, if the SNP do as well as they say they're going to, we'll see. Could they be delayed seriously till later in the year, much later in the year?
At the moment, the Scottish and Welsh governments are both saying they want those polls to happen on May 6th, but they're putting in contingency plans, which could involve a 6-month delay if the course of the pandemic is not where we hope it might be by that point. And the message from town halls in England to government too is that you've got to think about backup plans now. This is a complex operation. I understand that ministers want them to happen on May, but there is a realistic prospect they might shift, that might slip, because we know that this pandemic's been very unpredictable, and we've seen the course it's taken in recent weeks and months.
Well, a 6-month delay would completely reshape politics across this year, of course, if the Scottish elections are involved. Alex, thank you very much indeed. Alison, you cover Keir Starmer and the Labour leadership in great detail. Is this family message, council tax message, is that the kind of thing that's going to work for him? He's had all these problems about being called Captain Hindsight, and even given everything going on, the Labour Party haven't exactly broken through at the moment. So where do you see his position right now?
Yes, I think this is an absolutely crucial part of the plan really now to engage with families. I think going back on the point about the captain hindsight, I think he's certainly shown an awful lot more foresight than perhaps the Prime Minister has during all this. I mean, only last week he was calling for a full national lockdown significantly before the Prime Minister was on your show encouraging people to send their children back to school. But certainly families is absolutely crucial to this message from the party, because that's what decent, ordinary people who need to go back to Labour need to hear.
Right. Now, the other big story, of course, of the morning is President Trump. Will he be removed from office forcibly or otherwise in his last couple of weeks? It seems a very short period of time to be able to do this.
It's an incredibly short period of time. So it's very much more about what the long-term implications of impeaching him could be, or trying to get him out on the 25th Amendment. It now seems that the impeachment is probably more likely. As soon as tomorrow, Nancy Pelosi will begin the process to begin a formal impeachment. And then it could be, like within 1 hour of the inauguration of Joe Biden, that the process might properly begin with a view to that. Now, whether that's the right thing to do is very difficult. We saw some incredibly angry people, I think, there on Capitol Hill the other day. And Joe Biden's message has been entirely, up until this point, about healing. If we then go into a lengthy, very angry impeachment process, then you do wonder what that means for the beginning of his presidency.
Sure. Meanwhile, Twitter has snipped him off. And others are also coming off Twitter this morning, you see from the front pages.
Yes. I mean, Trump will be coming off. He's been banned from Twitter. He's looking at alternative social media platforms, but the reality is none of those are going to have the impact that Twitter has. But what I think it's an interesting thing that him, and then today we've also got Harry and Meghan have said that they're also coming off Twitter. It's interesting, you've got two sort of people, Trumps and the Sussexes, who both railed against the mainstream media, and now they're finding that social media isn't a very nice place for them. And so maybe they were better with the mainstream media anyway, although there's that sense they cannot control it in the same way.
Indeed. Coming off Twitter is the new thing, Alex. Of course, an awful lot of people are trying to work out with all these social media platforms what they get back from it, as well as what they put on. What are they getting back from it? It's very interesting that Harry and Meghan now feel that they can conduct themselves as a kind of global brand while ignoring these huge media platforms.
Yeah, well, I have some sympathy with the view.
Yeah.
You know, I think we've all had problems with social media in the past. And I think what is interesting about this story, as you say, and exactly as Alison the point made, that some people have turned away from the mainstream media because they didn't feel like it did them any favours, and have encountered social media being equally unforgiving. And we all know that, you know, social media, when it came to the Trump presidency, had a very specific role to play. And the decision by Twitter today has opened up a whole debate around free speech and whether that was the right decision or not. But it does seem perhaps some of the shine of social media has come off for quite a lot of people.
Well, can I just say, in relation to the mainstream media, that the papers are crammed with really interesting stories today. If you possibly can, either physically or online, read and buy a newspaper. And with that, so to the weather. Well, it has been a bitterly cold period the last few days. Really, really bitingly cold. Is this going to go on? Let's go over to the weather studio.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It is gradually going to be turning milder, actually, but this picture shouts out cold, and it has been a cold start for the southern half of the UK. The frost and the fog that we've got at the moment will gradually lift, and it may well brighten up a bit, but there's a lot of cloud on a westerly breeze today, and we've got wetter weather further north, heavier rain developing in western parts of Scotland. 8 degrees possible here, generally 5 or 6 degrees, 4 in the southeast, so a cold day here, but not as cold as it was yesterday. Overnight tonight, we hang on to a lot of cloud for most places, some patchy rain, that steadier, heavier rain in western Scotland threatening some flooding and some snow melt as well. For many places, temperatures will be a few degrees above freezing, but there's a risk of a frost returning to the southeast where the cloud is thinner and the air's a bit colder, and we've got some more snow showers in Shetland. Now, for many on Monday, it's going to be a milder day, a windier day. We've got more rain arriving too, and in northern Scotland, as that colder air starts to dig down, we could well see some snow as well. So it's going to be colder here. Elsewhere, though, temperatures around 7 to 10 degrees, and towards the southeast, it may well be a dry and bright day. Colder weather returning to many areas, I think, on Tuesday, and then it gets milder and wetter on Wednesday. Those temperatures, though, a lot higher than they were last week. Andrew.
Darren, I sometimes rely on the weather to give us the cheerful bit of the programme. Not, I'm afraid, today, but thank you very much indeed for that. Now, there's still a lot we don't know about the new variant of coronavirus and how we should all be responding to it. Just before we came on air, I spoke to Professor Peter Horby. He chairs NerveTag, a group which advises the government on virus threats, and I asked him why this new strain is more transmissible.
There's a number of reasons that could be. It could be that it's evading the immune response. It could be that it binds to cells better, so you need a smaller dose to get infected. It could be that people who are infected are producing more virus, or it could be that it's perhaps surviving better in the environment. We think the most likely explanation is that when people are infected, they're producing more virus, so they're more infectious.
Well, let's turn to the measures that are there to respond to the new variant. They are clearly more lenient than the measures we remember from back in March. Are they enough to stop this?
Well, it's very clear that we've got a big challenge on our hand. It was hard enough in the past to control this virus, and people endured a lot of restrictions, but those restrictions did work. We did see in the first and second lockdown that we saw a decrease in the transmission. Now we're in a situation where everything that was risky in the past is now more risky. So we are going to have to be very, very strict about the measures. Whether the current restrictions are enough, I think it remains to be seen. It will be a week or two before it becomes clear. That they may be sufficient, but we have to be very vigilant. And if there's any sign that they're not, then we're going to have to be even stricter, I'm afraid.
And what would even stricter mean in practice?
Well, I think the principles haven't changed. There's no evidence that this virus is being transmitted in any different way. It's just that people, when they've got it, have got more virus, so every contact is more risky. So the same principles apply. It's about decreasing social contacts, and if there are unavoidable social contacts, then being as strict as you can about distance and face masks and hand hygiene and ventilation, etc.
So thinking back to March and the spring, I can remember you could only go out for an hour, for instance, for any kind of exercise. And there were much stricter rules about meeting other people. Those are the kind of things we might see coming back if we don't get this under control now.
Yes, that's right. We have seen in the past very strict measures do work. And if the current measures aren't strict enough, then it's clear what we have to do.
I also remember back then people, sanitising parcels and shopping that was delivered to the door and sort of spraying every surface they came into contact with. And that seems to have gone away a bit. Is that the kind of thing that we're going to have to bring back?
I don't think those kind of measures are particularly useful.
Okay.
There is likely some risk from contact with surfaces, but it's likely to be contact with surfaces that have a high frequency. So, tills at supermarkets and things like that. So it's more about hygienes in those environments rather than necessarily parcels coming to the door.
A very broad question, but broadly speaking, do you think people are no longer following the rules strictly enough?
I don't know. There may be early signs that something is beginning to bite in terms of the interventions. I really hope people take this very seriously. If it was bad in March, it's much worse now. We've seen record numbers across the board, record numbers of cases, record numbers of hospitalisations, record numbers of deaths. We are now in the eye of the storm, so to speak, and people need to take this extremely seriously.
Before everybody just hides under the duvet in horror, there is some good news around. We are seeing some work done on the vaccine, and it appears that it clobbers both of the new variants, both the British new variant, as it were, and the South African one. Is that true?
Yes, the early signs are very encouraging. I really don't want people to hide under the duvet. We know what to do. We've done it before. It's not easy, but it works. And, we can see the end game now. We've got these vaccines. They're being rolled out. They're absolutely critical. There's now 3 approved in the UK. And although there are some concerns, we have to be very vigilant that the new viruses don't escape from the immunity from the vaccine. So far, the data we have is encouraging that the vaccines still work just as well. We need more data, but so far it's very encouraging.
And a lot of people have been talking about a race between the vaccine programme and the virus. Would you expect the virus to mutate at some point in a way that gets around the vaccines?
Every virus mutates. It makes mistakes as it's replicating. It ends up with changes in the biology of the virus, and then there's a very, very raw evolutionary process where the best virus wins. So when there's a lot of immunity in the population, whether that's vaccine or natural, you will see viruses emerge that escape that immunity. So in the long term, yes, I think that will happen, and we will have to update the vaccines probably. But we do that every year with influenza, so it's not something unprecedented. It's something we can do. But I don't think that's going to be an issue in the short term. Not for the next year, I would not expect that.
Thinking about that flu parallel, which has been used by other people as well, does that mean that for the rest of our lives we may well have COVID around to deal with, something that we get vaccinated against every winter and is just part of the background, as it were, of everyday life?
There's a big spectrum of viruses. You can go from flu, where we need to update the vaccine almost every year, through to something like measles, where we hardly ever have to change the vaccine. It's a very stable virus. This virus, coronavirus, is somewhere in the middle. So if we do have to update the vaccine, I doubt it would be every year, but it may be every few years that it has to be updated. And we don't yet know how long immunity lasts, and so how frequently we would have to revaccinate people.
But the notion that COVID will be sort of banished from the Earth's surface in due course is wrong, is it? This is going to be something that survives around human populations for a very, very long time to come.
Yes, the one virus we've managed to get rid of, the smallpox virus, had a very different characteristics to this virus. This one, I think, will not go away. We're going to have to live with it. But that may change significantly. It may well become more of an endemic virus that's with us all the time and may cause some seasonal pressures and some excess deaths, but is not causing the huge disruption that we're seeing now.
Now, there's also some good news on treatments in hospitals. Just tell us a little bit about what's happened this week, as it were.
Yeah, so great news. We've got the second drug now that's proven to save lives. We showed earlier this year that the steroid dexamethasone reduced fatality rates quite significantly. And we've just had news this week that a second class of drugs called interleukin-6 inhibitors, in addition to dexamethasone, give an added benefit, and they reduce deaths quite significantly. So we've now got two drugs that in combination do reduce death rates. The new drugs have been tested in intensive care patients, and so we know they're effective in that population. We now need to get results in the broader hospital population to see if we can extend those benefits.
Let's just go back to this race between the vaccine and the virus. Does vaccinating all the most vulnerable parts of the population return us to normal quite quickly?
I don't think it will return us to normal. There will still be a large number of people being infected, and although the absolute risks of someone under the age of 80 dying or ending up in hospital are low, with a large number of infections, that still translates into a lot of people. And so we're going to have to manage the virus with social distancing measures as well as vaccination for the coming months.
Chris Whitty suggested that we will still have social distancing measures of some kind next winter, and it sounds to me rather as if you agree with him.
I think that's likely. I think it very much depends on how well we can scale up the vaccine program and how quickly we can get it out, to a substantial proportion of the population.
This is a very grim moment, and without wishing to end on too macabre a note, your colleague, Professor Ferguson on NerveTag, has said that he thinks that before this is over, we will have 100,000 deaths from coronavirus. Do you agree with him?
The models are very good at the moment, and what we've seen is that the predictions have played out, and so those predictions of increased numbers of deaths are probably pretty accurate. Unfortunately, a lot of these things are baked in, as we say, and are unavoidable now, but it's absolutely critical that we act now to make sure that we don't bake in any more deaths. We know what to do, we've seen it works in the past, and we must do it.
Professor Horby, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, listening to that from his home, he's observing his own advice about not going out on a Sunday morning, is the Health Secretary, Matt Hancock. Mr. Hancock, welcome. Thanks for joining us. Can I ask, first of all, is the NHS close to being overwhelmed?
Well, the NHS is under very serious pressure, as the Chief Medical Officer said. It's probably under the greatest pressure it ever has been. And that's particularly true in some parts of the country, but frankly, it's true right across the UK. And we all can do something about it. You know, the NHS has never needed everybody to do something more than it's needed that now, and that's to stay at home.
Your phrase has been in the past overwhelmed. How many weeks away are we from the NHS being overwhelmed?
Well, if everybody stays at home, and unless they absolutely have to leave, if everybody does that, everybody follows the rules, then we should see the case rates start to come down, and we should see that pressure start to abate. And so it depends. The answer to the question, frankly, Andrew, depends on what people do. And I think that the message is extremely clear, which is, unless you have to, you should stay at home.
So when we come to what that big word overwhelmed actually means, what would it mean? We've got stories this morning, for instance, of ambulances having to wait for 9 hours before they decant people into hospital. And we've had lots and lots of stories about what's going on inside hospitals. What would overwhelming the NHS actually mean?
Well, at the moment, even though it's incredibly difficult, people are able to get the care that they need. And that's one of the wonderful things about the NHS is that it is a promise to all of us that we can get the care that we need when we need it. And it's universal. It's for everyone according to need, not ability to pay. Now, this team in the NHS, colleagues right across the board, are working incredibly hard to deliver that right now. And, you've seen some of the stories from not just from emergency departments and intensive care units, but across the board, ambulance services, like you say, people working incredibly hard to make sure that people get that care. We'll open the Nightingale hospitals as needed. We'll make sure that we expand capacity. We've built extra capacity this summer. But ultimately, we've got to get the cases down so that people can continue to get that care.
We've got nurses and doctors on their knees with exhaustion. If the worst happens and the system can no longer cope properly, does that mean also that the vaccine rollout will be affected? Because we're relying on the same nurses and the same kind of facilities to help put the jabs in people's arms.
Well, clearly, the NHS got so much on, and this is why it's under so much pressure. Really, 3 huge projects. One is looking after people who are ill in hospital with COVID, over 30,000 people. The second is rolling out the vaccine. Now, primarily, but not entirely, that's being done through GP surgeries and these new vaccination centres that we're opening this week, rather than through the hospitals, although hospitals are also vaccinating. But the large majority will be done through primary care, through GPs and communities, pharmacists, and these big centres. And then the third job the NHS has got on is everything it normally does. And if you think about it, at this time of year, the NHS is normally under pressure, even without those 2 huge additional tasks. So, my gratitude, all of our gratitude, goes out to the team working across the NHS, and it is working harder than it's ever worked before. And we can all do something to help, which is to stay at home, because every time you try to flex the rules, that could be fatal. And we all...
I'm sorry to jump in, but this sounds to me as if you think people are flexing the rules and you're worried that people are not observing all the rules as stringently as they ought to be.
Well, I think the vast majority of people are following the rules. And the data show that most people are staying at home. But you can see, it's hard. It's not easy. As
compared to March,
the professor just said, it's not easy. But if you can do something from home and you don't need to go outside of home to do it, then you should. Things like I'm here at home this morning. I normally like to come into the studio because you have a chance of a more in-depth interview somehow. But actually, let's just stay at home and do it from home because you can. And this is just one tiny example of the plethora of examples that there are of where people just need to not just follow the letter of the rules, but follow the spirit as well and play their part. I know it's tough.
In that same spirit, a very straightforward question: do you know whether people are following the rules that they've been told about in the same way and as stringently as they were back in March?
Well, we don't know because we didn't have, frankly, the data and the surveillance systems back in March when all this had to be brought in at such pace. But we do know that people are being more stringent than in the November lockdown, and that's important.
But that's not really the right. That's not really the appropriate parallel. And you do know, for instance, about traffic, and certainly there's been figures bandied around saying that the amount of traffic on the roads, the number of people in the underground, the number of people using buses is far, far higher now than it was in March.
Well, there are signs that people are doing well. As I say, the data that we do have that in detail shows that people are staying at home more than they were in November, and. In a way, the comparison to March, what really matters is that people do follow the rules, because we've seen that pressure on the NHS. And also, I would say, Andrew, although the comparison to March would be useful, we have a new variant that passes on so much easier. We have a new variant, and the measures are more lenient than they were in March. So if this doesn't get under control, and a lot of people in the NHS think you have lost control at this stage, if this doesn't get under control, what new measures could you introduce? Well, obviously, we look at the data all the time and are constantly looking at what is the right thing to do. But at the moment, the very clear message is that people need to stay at home. The government rules only are one part of this. What really matters is what every single person does, because that's how the virus spreads. So, obviously we keep these things, we're vigilant, but what really matters is how everybody watching this programme behaves and how minimising the social contact.
And because you've said it so many times already, I do take it that you are worried about compliance. But of course, the government rules are also absolutely central to this. So are you considering, I'm not saying taking a decision on, but are you considering things like curfews, closing nurseries, ending some of those support bubbles, going back to only an hour of exercise outside, and telling people in crowded outdoor spaces to wear masks? Are those the kind of things that you could consider if you don't get this under control very quickly?
Well, I don't want to speculate, because the most important message is not whether the government will further strengthen the rules. The most important thing is that people stay at home and follow the rules that we've got. And that is, in terms of the scale of the impact on the cases, that is the most important thing that we can do collectively as a society.
Now, one of the reasons that maybe people haven't been staying at home enough is because they're not getting the financial support they need. Is the government going to look at helping further people who simply lose an immediate cash income as they stay at home? Because not everybody is covered by your scheme.
Well, we've got the most generous schemes that have ever been in place in the UK, and some of the most generous schemes that are there in the entire world. And the IMF, for instance, has looked at these economic schemes and has compared them and has complemented the schemes that we've put in place here in the UK. So obviously, again, we're always updating those. You've seen after we announced the lockdown, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced further support. Of course he did, because this is a massive national effort. But we have these very generous schemes in place. If
we look at somebody who's been told to self-isolate for 10 days, an average worker, according to the TUC, that person would lose £690 straight away in earnings. It's a huge disincentive, and maybe part of the reason that you are struggling to get your message over.
Well, I think that's if I may say so, only a partial way of looking at it, because we have the £500 support payment for people on low incomes. People on higher incomes usually find it easier to bridge and are more likely to be in jobs where you're paid at full salary if you're sick. So So I think
7 out of
support,
10 people don't qualify for that, Minister. 7 out of 10. Most people don't qualify for that.
and that's all about targeting support at those who need it most. So we're targeting support absolutely at the 1 in 3 people who, or the 3 in 10, if you like, who need it most, and are most likely to find it difficult to follow the isolation rules if they don't get that financial support from the government. So that's in a way that you answer your own question, which is absolutely we have a targeted approach.
Well, let's look at some of the things that you are doing to try to get this under control. You've made a big announcement about the number of tests of asymptomatic people in the community. Are these the same lateral flow tests that you know from Liverpool won't give you enough accurate results?
They're the same lateral flow tests that worked effectively in Liverpool, yes, where the science is really clear, which is that if you have a test and we find more people who have got the disease, we're able to break those chains of transmission. And some people do need to leave home in order to go to work. And so we want to put testing in place, especially for those people, to try to make going out to work as safe as possible and to find as many positives. The good news about these tests is that they're really easy. They're easy to do. They're easy to administer. You get the result back more or less immediately within half an hour. And that means that we can find far more people and get these tests out to far more people. And the science on them is really clear. We published all of the data on how effective they are.
You say the science is clear and this is good news, but in Liverpool, 60% of positive cases were missed by these tests. And the scientists reported back to you from Liverpool, they said, the analysis does not provide any clear indication that mass asymptomatic testing had an impact on the trend in cases or on the trend in hospital admissions in Liverpool during the period. So there's the less good news. They're simply not good enough.
That's not the assessment. And
it's from your own. It's from your own paper. It was your own scientists to you.
What happened in Liverpool was that with this mass asymptomatic testing, we saw the case rate in Liverpool fall more sharply than it did in other similar areas where only the restrictions were brought in. And of course, you've got to get the testing as targeted as possible, and it only ever can be one tool in the armoury. But nevertheless, it brings a significant additional benefit if you can identify those cases where you wouldn't identify them otherwise.
I've just read you your own scientists saying exactly the opposite. But let's move on. Let's move on to the vaccination programme itself. How many people have been vaccinated so far?
Well, we're going to publish the daily data from tomorrow. The good news is that over the last week, we've vaccinated more people than in the entirety of December. So we're accelerating the rollout. It's increasing.
How many? Can you give me a figure?
Well, it's around the 2 million mark, but we're going to publish the exact figures tomorrow and then henceforth on a daily basis. The good news is that we're getting to over 200,000 people a day is significant progress. And amongst those who we need to reach most, amongst the over 80s, we've now vaccinated around a third of all of the over 80s. So very, very good progress.
Let's talk about the exit strategy, because the two things are very closely connected. Sir Peter Horby was saying on this programme a few moments ago that, yes, you do have to vaccinate people in their 50s and their 40s before we get out of this. In other words, simply vaccinating the most high-risk group, the oldest people, is not enough, to use your phrase, to cry freedom and get out of that. That is over-optimistic boosterism. You have to vaccinate many, many more people down the scale. And indeed, the inventor of the Pfizer vaccine said you had to vaccinate everybody by the autumn. Are you going to be able to do that?
Yes. So we're absolutely going to.
Everybody will be vaccinated by the autumn.
Every adult will be offered a vaccine by the autumn. Absolutely. I totally agree. It's very, very important. So, of course, you've got to do it according to need, because somebody in a care home, for instance, is many, many times more likely to die if they catch coronavirus than somebody like me in my 40s. But absolutely, we're going to offer the vaccine to everybody. We've got over 350 million doses on order. They're not all here yet, and we're rolling them out as fast as they get delivered. But we are going to have enough to be able to offer a vaccine to everyone over the age of 18, and by the autumn. Now, I really hope that everybody will take that up. And the take-up so far has been absolutely fantastic. And the take-up of the flu jab this year has been over 80%. So 4 out of 5 people over 65 taking the flu jab, which is good news and a good indicator. But yes, it's very important that, of course, we start with the most vulnerable, but then we get through and we vaccinate everyone.
Now, almost everybody that is watching this programme right now wants to know about the exit strategy, when this is all going to start to change and lift. You have said, as a government, absolutely that schools will be the first thing to reopen. Isn't it now the time to be absolutely clear with people about the criteria on which you will take that decision? Does the R number have to be below 1 before schools are reopened? What has to happen to community transmission before schools are reopened? If you tell people now what your thinking is, then you have much more trust going forward when that decision is taken.
I think that's fair. So we've set out 4 conditions. The first is that there shouldn't be a major new variation in the virus itself, because we all know how much more challenging this has become with the new variant. The second is that we obviously need to see the vaccine rollout proceeding effectively, and it currently is. It's going very well, and we've got the new vaccination centres opening next week. The third is we want to see the number of deaths coming down. Of course, we all do. And because the number of deaths is highly concentrated in the most vulnerable group, more than 4 out of 5 deaths have sadly been amongst the over 70s and the clinically extremely vulnerable, who are in those top groups who we are going to vaccinate by mid-February. That means that I hope we can see the number of deaths coming down once we've got those vaccines done, and the 2 to 3 weeks afterwards that it takes to get the immunity. And then the fourth condition is, of course, the pressure on the NHS. And we can see these very significant pressures on the NHS right now. It's always challenging in the middle of winter, but this is like no other winter before. And obviously, we want to see that pressure reducing as well. So those are the 4 conditions that will follow. By the middle of February, by February the 15th, our goal is to have offered a vaccine to everybody in the top 4 most vulnerable groups, which is the over 70s, the clinically extremely vulnerable, the care home residents and elderly care home residents and their carers, and NHS and social care staff. Now, we're on track for delivering that. But then it still takes weeks after that, 2 to 3 weeks for them to get immunity. And during that time, we'll keep going down the age spectrum. And we want to get to all the over 50s by the spring, and then keep vaccinating all the way through to everybody over the age of 18. So that's the plan. I would like to put more precise timings on when the restrictions can be lifted, but unfortunately, as you know from the discussions we've had many times, you just can't do that. We've got to track that data and see how things progress.
We've been talking about schools. Was the Prime Minister right to say on this programme last week that primary schools in England were safe?
Yes, and the Prime Minister's been really... Yes,
but they're also vectors of transmission. How can a vector of transmission be safe?
Well, I'm going to explain again, as he did on this programme last week. I think he was very clear, which is that schools are safe for the children in them. And there's no evidence that teachers catch COVID any more than any other profession. However, in the same way that for adults, around 1 in 3 people catch the disease, don't know they've got it, they're asymptomatic, but they can pass it on. So children can be safe, yet still have the disease asymptomatically, and therefore pass it on. Well, so he was very clear about it. If you watch back to last week, Andrew, he was very clear about how schools are safe for children. However, they still add to and contribute to the spread of the disease. Hence the decision that we've had to take.
It's just quite confusing to people if children are passing the disease around and causing more illness and ultimately more deaths. It doesn't seem very safe. Nonetheless, let's move
But
on.
it's safe to the children.
Safe for some people, but not for others.
It's safe for children. I think if you watch back, I think people do understand this.
All right.
Actually,
Okay,
there are two parts to it, though. So to communicate it, it's really clear, as the Prime Minister was last weekend.
Final question on schools.
Safe
Sorry.
for the children.
Final.
So children of key workers. If one of the parents is a key worker, then the children can go to school. And the children are safe in the school setting, and there's no evidence that teachers are any more at risk than the rest of the population. However, schools still, contribute to the spread of the disease, hence the decision that unfortunately we had to take last week.
So at the moment, some schools have 50% of their normal capacity in school because of those exemptions. Doesn't that mean that schools are going to have to wait even longer across the rest of the country to reopen? Isn't that going to keep things going faster?
Well, you've got to keep schools open for the children of key workers. Of course you do. And we've set the criteria out very clearly for who those key workers are. But you've got to, I need the schools open so that NHS staff can get to work and to look after people. In the same way, we need the critical services of this country to continue to run. Having said that, of course, everybody who can work from home should work from home. But it's really important that we still have people coming into work. I mean, the NHS would be under even more pressure if you didn't have that. And so these are difficult balances, but it's very, very important that schools do remain open for those key workers.
We're almost out of time, so I'm going to ask you for a quick question. Former Culture Secretary, were you pleased to see Twitter banning President Trump?
Well, what I would say is that I think that, firstly, obviously, the scenes clearly encouraged by President Trump, the scenes at the Capitol were terrible, and I was very sad to see that, because American democracy is such a proud thing. But there's something also that's changed, which is that social media platforms are making editorial decisions now. That's clear, because they're choosing who should and shouldn't have a voice on their platform. Now, I think we should just be straightforward about that. Now, it has consequences, and they're very much, as you say, for the culture department, not for me. But I think that I think those scenes in America were really, really were really upsetting. Anybody who believes in the values of democracy.
Sure. I think in terms of pleased or not, that was a rather lengthy and serpentine yes, if I may say so. Matt Hancock, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Now, during the first lockdown, the BBC helped in trying to educate children stuck at home with online learning. This time round, it's ditched familiar programmes in BBC Two, including quizzes, in order to teach on live TV. Well, the question is why? What is wrong with the daily quiz programmes? To explain, I spoke to the physicist and one of the faces of science on the BBC, Professor Brian Cox.
One of the big problems with homeschooling that we identified in the first lockdown is that many of the children who particularly need it don't have access to laptops or iPads or good broadband. And so I think it made absolute sense to take a channel like BBC Two and CBBC that everybody can access without that technology and make these educational programmes available on those channels as well.
It's fairly clear, isn't it, that this pandemic will exacerbate problems of equality of opportunity. What are your thoughts about that going forward for possibly a generation to come?
Well, I agree. And, I've spent my life, other people see me on television, most of my life has been in the education sector in universities. And I firmly believe that one of the key levers to access inequality is it's about equality of opportunity. If the pandemic has shone a light on inequality in education and access to education, then it means that when the dust settles and we move on and the vaccines have worked and the virus is under control, perhaps then it will stimulate a deeper conversation about how we do make sure that every child has access to the best possible education.
Do you think that the experience of the pandemic is going to drive more people, as it were, away from the humanities and towards science STEM subjects?
It's unprecedented. that you go from discovering a virus just over 12 months ago, sequencing its genome, understanding it, building not one, but 4, 5, 6, 8 vaccines at least that are effective. That's built. The reason we could do that is not because we threw money at the problem in late 2019, early 2020 alone. Right? It is partly that, but it's to do with the fact that we had that capacity. So we had a series of experts, PhD students, postgrads, postdocs, all the way through to professors who had been funded for many, many years. We had a knowledge base. Now, much of that knowledge base was built not to specifically address the problems caused by a pandemic, but just because there's a science base there. And I think that may be a lesson that we learned.
When we spoke before, I vividly remember you talking about homeschooling your son. There's lots of people watching this who are probably tearing their hair out, wondering how they are going to successfully homeschool their kids over this next couple of months to come. What's your advice for them? Have you learnt anything from the process that you can share with people?
If possible, it can't be a chore for your child. It needs to be as entertaining. The joy of education and the joy of acquiring knowledge is very important. So I think sometimes, children are like us. We all know how difficult it's been. We all know that sometimes we can't concentrate from 10 o'clock till 11 o'clock. These are very strange circumstances. And for me, what I found is recognizing that and not saying, right, you have to do it now. The point is, we've got a day here, and at some point, I would like you to acquire this knowledge.
Because, I mean, there may not be an awful lot of joy present if you've got 3 kids around the table and you're trying to teach them maths, science and English all at the same time, all on the same day. It's really tough for parents.
Oh, it is, because I think we discussed last time, I think what most parents, me included, will be discovering is that teaching at these different levels, so your 6-year-olds, 8-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 14-year-olds, that is a skill. It is a profession. And you cannot expect, maybe this is a piece of advice that I've noticed, you can't expect to be as anywhere near as good as a professional teacher.
A sensible and chastening thought to end on. Professor Brian Cox, thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, last week I spoke to the Prime Minister Boris Johnson in the first of our leaders' interviews this year. This morning I'm joined here in the studio by the leader of the Labour Party, Sir Keir Starmer. Sir Keir, welcome. Are these new rules tough enough?
Well, they are tough and they're necessary.
Enough?
They may not be tough enough, but in a sense, I think the most important thing is for people to get that message about stay at home. And it's up to the government to put that message out there the whole time. We've had mixed messages, I'm afraid, for the last 9 months, which is why we've got a problem. I would like to see the Prime Minister out there every day with the press conference, making sure that message is absolutely getting through, because that's the most crucial thing.
We've seen, in terms of compliance, we've seen this extraordinary scenes from Derbyshire where 2 women with cups of tea were collared by the police and got into serious trouble. Is that the kind of thing that you think is going to have to happen around the country?
Well, I don't think that was a particularly good example, and there will always be examples of that. The police, by and large, have done a really good job in very difficult circumstances.
Aren't we going to have to find? Well, aren't the police going to have to fine people rather than warn them now?
I think there's a move.
Given the severity of what's going on in the country.
I think there's a move today from the police to say, look, we'll give 1 warning, then we'll move to a fine. And I don't quarrel with that. That may be a good thing. But the most important thing, actually, because the vast majority of the British public have complied with the rules. They've done that for 9 months. But they need clarity about exactly what is asked of them, because we've had all this mixed messaging, Stay at home, don't stay at home, eat out, don't eat out, go back to work, don't go back to work. All of that has led us to where we are. We need, if we can, to summons the spirit of last March when more people were actually staying at home.
So clarity is our watchword. In that spirit, should nursery school close?
Well, I think there's a case for looking at nursery schools. We're talking to the scientists about it, but I think quite a lot of people are surprised that primary schools are closed and that nurseries aren't closed.
That sounds like a probably yes.
I think they probably should be closed. I do want to talk to the scientists about that, but I think there are nursery schools. I mean, one of the problems we've got is it's very hard to see what tougher measures can be put in place, because the measures are pretty tough. That's why actually complying with that stay-at-home message, I know I'm saying it over and over again, but it really is so important that as leader of the opposition, we carry that message to people to stay at home.
Well, there has been a bit of lack of clarity from both sides across the Commons on this. The union Unison has called for nursery schools to be closed. Talking about primary schools, however, I had the Prime Minister in that very seat last week, and he said that schools were safe. And 36 hours later, he closed all the primary schools in England. When did you decide that all the schools had to be closed?
Well, on Sunday, I said that a lockdown was needed and called for that. We saw the SAGE minutes, the medical advice, just before the new year. And it seemed obvious to me that that's where it's heading. I thought the closure of schools was inevitable. I didn't want to close schools, I'll be honest about that, because I think closing schools should be the last resort, and it has a huge impact, particularly on vulnerable children and children who don't have access to devices, etc.
In terms of clear messaging, if you thought it was inevitable, should you not have said it earlier? Because on the Sunday you said specifically that you didn't want to call for schools to close, and the following morning your education spokesman, Keir, said schools should be the very last place to close. That was Kate Green on the Monday morning. So you did not give a different message from the Prime Minister during that period.
Well, I didn't want schools to close. I'm not going to shy away from that. I did say on Sunday I thought it was inevitable and we needed a plan for it, but I didn't want schools to close. I understand it's part of the national restrictions and that's the right thing, but the impact on children of further school closures is huge. They were out of school for the best part of 6 months last year.
It's a really hard choice. I mean, I accept that. It's a very hard choice. But you had the SAGE advice from the 1st of January. You could see SAGE saying schools are going to have to close if we're going to get the R below 1. And like the government, you didn't say anything for quite a while to come.
Well, we got the SAGE advice, I think, as you say, on the 1st of January. I think Sunday was the 3rd of January, which is when I said there needs to be a national lockdown.
I suppose
that happened the next day. But I mean, look, Andrew, I'm not going to shy away from it. I didn't want schools to close because of the impact that has on vulnerable children and on those that struggle to learn at home, and that will be a lifelong impact if we're not careful. And I also felt...
I'm sorry, the reason I'm asking this is that a lot of people have looked at the government's response to this and suggested the Prime Minister is slightly too slow to take really tough decisions. And just looking at this very tough decision, I acknowledge that you would have been just as slow.
Well, I didn't want schools to close, but Andrew, let's look at the criticism there, because what the Prime Minister was trying to do on your programme last week, what the Prime Minister was trying to do was to suggest that everything was going fine and it was the new variant that's knocked us off course. That hasn't been right, because he was very slow into the first lockdown last March.
Was going to be fine.
He did say
he wanted to keep schools open, as you have said.
He said the tiered system was working, and he gave the impression on your show and other times that it's just the variant that's knocked him and the country off course. If you look at the last 9 months, he's been slow into every decision. The first lockdown was slow. He was slow on protective equipment, slow on testing. Just let me finish this, if you will. When it came to a circuit break in the autumn, I called for a circuit break. He ridiculed that and said he wasn't going to do it. It was obviously what the medical advice was suggesting. Then he did it, and we had a longer lockdown. Just before Christmas, I said to the Prime Minister, this 5-day mixing is going to cause real problems. And he said to me, you're trying to cancel Christmas. Why don't you just get honest? And then a number of days later, he did it. So the general criticism that the Prime Minister's been slow and incompetent is there. And that's why...
That's right. I'm just looking at this particular decision.
Yes.
On this particular decision, you were just as slow and just as indecisive as the Prime Minister, and I wonder whether this is the moment to apologise to the trade unions involved, for instance, who were saying much earlier that schools were going to have to close.
Well, look, I didn't want schools to close. I didn't think it was right for retail to be open in certain parts of the country and schools to be closing. It became inevitable, and that's part of the national restrictions. But look, to the trade unions, to teachers, to staff who worked hard over Christmas to try and get schools back up and running, I think we all owe them an apology, and we all owe them, recognition of what they have done, because they've worked hard now for 9 months in really difficult circumstances, either in schools with key workers, then when they reopened, and trying to do teaching online. This is a real struggle, and we should all recognise that.
So there is an apology. Let's talk about getting the schools back open again. What are your criteria for what would have to happen before schools can start to reopen?
Well, I think the vaccination really is the way out of this. We need to get those first 4 groups vaccinated, and if that can be done by mid-February, then that is a huge step in the right direction. It's a job and a half,
That's the end of February we're talking about.
No, the middle of February for that. And I hope that's what the Prime Minister has said. We'll hold him to that, but we will also help him with that, because I think the vaccine is the only way out now, and we need to see, 2 million we need 2 million doses a week in the next week or two. We need to ramp that up in February. So there's a huge piece of work to be done here, and we all need to play our part in this.
I'm sorry, let me jump in. So if community transmission is still really high, if hospital admissions are still really high, if the R is above 1, but the vaccination programme has gone according to plan, you still reopen schools?
No, we'll have to look at all the criteria, but the most important thing is that vaccination programme. It's very difficult to see how we can start lifting restrictions in any meaningful way until the vaccination programme, at least that first part of it, is rolled out successfully. And the key questions there are, does the NHS have the capacity for 2 million jabs a week? I think it does. I hope it does, and we should all do whatever we can to ramp that up. And secondly, will the manufacturers be able to deliver? Now, I saw this.
Do you think teachers need to be vaccinated before schools reopen?
Look, of course, there's a strong case for teachers, for police officers, for prison officers. I get all that.
Before schools are open.
But just bear me out. I think at the moment, the first 4 categories, which are targeted on those that are most likely to go into hospital and tragically to die, are right. I think there is then a case for saying, well, let's look at other categories. And teachers may well be one of those categories. But what I do feel strongly is that we've got to keep to the original 4 categories are the right categories.
Sure, but is the reopening of schools contingent on teachers being vaccinated or not?
No, I don't know that it necessarily is, although if that can happen, that would be a good thing. But I just want to deal this argument that there are sectors where there's a very strong case for vaccination for obvious reasons. And I understand that, and we're going to have to accommodate that, frankly. But at the moment, we do need to focus on those that are most likely to go into hospital and tragically to die.
Everybody is wanting this vaccine rollout to work as fast and effectively as possible. If you were Prime Minister, what is the one thing that you would do now to ensure a better rollout of the vaccine?
Make sure there are vaccine centres across the country. The government is doing that. Make sure we're talking to the manufacturers so that the doses come on stream.
The government isn't doing. Really.
We launched last week a Let's Vaccinate Britain campaign, which is to get Labour Party members, trade unionists and people in communities to come and volunteer to help. I went to Newham to the vaccination centre last week, and what I saw there was a fantastic operation with lots of older people coming in to be vaccinated, but they needed an army of volunteers to pass the information into communities, to help people get to the vaccination centre, to do some of the administration, to steward them in to the building and to help them afterwards. So what I would do is what I did last week, which is launch the campaign to say, where you can volunteer to help with this, please come forward and do that.
So
and people are doing that.
I mean, the government are asking for volunteers in terms of retired doctors and retired nurses to come and help the vaccination programme, but you go further than that.
I'd go further than that, because one of the most important things is to reach people in their communities, to give them the confidence to come forward, and volunteers can do that. And then there's the practical questions of how do you actually get someone...
you have to have to volunteer for this?
Well, all sorts of different skills, but practical skills to get people to the vaccination centre. What I saw was people arriving in cars, in taxis, in different ways, getting to the vaccination centre. They need the information, they need the confidence for that, and the practical backup. And the Red Cross were there doing it as well. And all of that. I actually don't think this is an area where there's anything between the government and everybody else. Everybody in Britain wants to pull together to be part of this national effort, and so do I. So what I've said to the Prime Minister is, notwithstanding the other challenges I've put to you, I will work with you on this. We will all pull together on this.
Apart from the need for more volunteers for the system, you would say the vaccination programme, they're doing all the right things, the things that you would do in terms of organising the centres, organising the supply of vaccine, all of that you're happy with?
Well, I want to make sure the resource is there for the NHS to hit that 2 million a week and be assured about that. I am very concerned, it's a point I think you put to the Health Secretary, that with the stress and strain on the NHS at the moment, that is a real struggle, which goes back to making sure people stay at home. But Andrew, on this issue, I actually do want to work with the government. I want the government to succeed. We'll hold them to account, but we'll help them on this. It's very important.
So John Bell, very prominent figure, John. You know, said this about the NHS. He said the NHS has the theoretical capacity to immunise everybody in 5 days if they want to, but I don't get the sense they're really motivated.
Well, I didn't hear John say that. At the moment, as I understand it, there aren't the doses of the vaccine available to the NHS, even if they could roll that out in 5 days. So I don't know. I didn't hear John say that. I respect him hugely. But as I understand the problem at the moment is, does the NHS have the capacity to do the doses week on week? I hope it does. I think it does. And I know everybody's working at great speed on this. My wife works in the NHS in a hospital. I know from her experience just how hard people are working. But then there is also whether the manufacturers are supplying the doses in time for that vaccination. But look, I want this to succeed. I want this national effort to succeed.
You voted for the Brexit deal.
Yeah.
Is there any aspect of the Brexit deal that if you were Prime Minister you would reopen, revisit and try to renegotiate? Anything that you would do to change it?
We voted for the deal because the choices before us were to vote for the deal, a thin deal, a deal that isn't a good deal for our manufacturers, for the service sector certainly, but the alternative was no deal. So we voted for that deal.
If it isn't a good deal, which bits would you reopen?
Well, there are bits already that need to be improved on. I mean, if you look at the creative industries and how they are going to operate across borders, there's huge gaps for them. The service sector, of course, has been largely left out. But I don't think that there's scope for major renegotiation. We've just had 4 years of negotiation. We've arrived at a treaty, and now we've got to make that treaty work. It is thin, it isn't what the government promised, but it is better than no deal, and we need to make it work. And you can see one of our criticisms of the government was that they didn't prepare, and you're already seeing the problems at the borders.
So would you reintroduce free movement of people?
Look, I don't think there's an argument for reopening those aspects of the treaty. We have a treaty. Andrew, just hear me out. We have a treaty. It's a thin treaty. It's not what was promised. But I'm very conscious of the fact that everything I'm doing, everything the Labour Party is doing, is geared and focused on winning a general election in 2024. If we win that election and a Labour government comes in, we will inherit that treaty, and the British people will expect us to make it work, and the EU 27 will expect us to make it work. And I enter it in that spirit.
You say you won't look again at the matter of free movement of people. Huge numbers of people in the Labour leadership election and in the country voted for you on the basis that you would do that because you told them you would do that. The Daily Mirror asked you in specific terms, if you become Labour Prime Minister, will you bring back freedom of movement of EU citizens to the UK? And your answer was yes, look, of course.
Andrew, what I'm saying is this. We've had, 4 years of negotiations with the EU. The last thing anybody wants, including the EU, is to start again from scratch with this treaty. We have got to, for better or for worse, thin treaty though it is, we will inherit that treaty when we come into government in 2024.
So you won't reintroduce free movement. You said that back in January last year, so not that long ago. And also it was the 6th of your 10 pledges that you were going to bring back free movement. And now you're saying, no, I won't.
Well, Andrew, what I'm saying is we've negotiated a treaty, or the Prime Minister's negotiated a treaty. That now is the basis of our relationship with the EU. We didn't know what that was until we saw it just before Christmas. We now know what it is. It's thin. It's not what was promised, but whether we like it or not, that is going to be the treaty that an incoming Labour government inherits and has to make work. And,
I think quite a lot
it is not being straight with the British public to say we can come into office in 2024 and operate some other treaty. We have to make that treaty work.
It's quite a moment to drop a pledge as big as that and say that a future Labour government will not reopen free movement of people. A lot of Labour Party supporters who may have rejoined the European movement and who desperately hope the struggle to rejoin the EU starts here and starts with you will be very, very disappointed to hear
I don't think there's a case for rejoining the EU. I've said that before. I think I've said it on your programme. But I think pretending to the British public that somehow, after 4 years of negotiation, the treaty that's just been secured is going to be up for grabs and that the EU are going to start saying, let's start all over again. That is not realistic.
So
that is not going to happen.
You support the government's points-based immigration system?
Well, look, we didn't support the government on that. We didn't vote for their immigration legislation, not least because of the impact it has on key workers and those that have led us through the pandemic. But the point I'm making, Andrew, is that we were faced in the end with a choice between that deal, bad though it is, and no deal. And I've always said in the public interest, in the national interest, there should be a deal.
You're now hooked on having voted for a bad and thin deal. And in areas where most of your supporters would like you to look again, free movement of people being a very, very obvious example, you are stuck with doing nothing going ahead. Why did you pledge it in the first place?
Well, look, Andrew, we were stuck with a choice between the deal on the table and no deal, and we made the right choice about that. I'm being honest about 2024, which is to say that whether we like that deal or not, and I think it's a thin deal, I don't think it delivers on the Prime Minister's promises, it is the deal that is going to be there in 2024. And the British public are going to look to the Labour Party and to the Prime Minister of a Labour government and say, you need to make that work. There's no good complaining about it. And the EU27 will also say, we have all signed this off, and you need to work with us to make it work. That is the realistic basis upon which we're going into that 2024 election.
So it's a thin deal, but you're going to stick with it. You did pledge free movement of people, but you're not going to do that. And you support the government by and large over the pandemic. Some people say, what does Keir Starmer really stand for? Let me ask you some clear, specific economic questions, which might help us answer that. Do you think everybody should have free broadband?
Well, that was in the Labour Party manifesto, and the case has been made for it. I actually think we should target those that most need it in the immediate weeks, because between now and Easter, many children and young people are not going to be able to learn at home, either because they haven't got devices, laptops or whatever it is, or because the broadband, they don't have broadband, or they have expensive broadband because they're paying for data. That is an immediate problem that needs to be dealt with. So focus on those children or those families that most need it now would be my advice. And
in the long run, does that free broadband thing hold or not?
In the long run, we'll have to see what the situation is in 2024.
Let me ask you something else. Debt at the moment is about 100% of GDP. What would be a dangerous level from your point of view?
Well, we're going to have to reassess debt. We're at huge debt, huge borrowing. I'm not at this stage, Andrew, going to set out what the position is going to be in 2024. I don't know the state of the economy there. I do know that we need to have priorities going forward, secure our economy, protect the NHS and rebuild our country. When it gets to 2024, I will spell out in great detail what an incoming Labour government will do.
Do you still want to scrap universal credit?
Yes, universal credit needs to be scrapped and a new scheme put in place. In the immediate future, what I'm very determined to do is to persuade the government to stop the cut to universal credit that's due to come in April. That is going to affect millions of families, that cut to universal credit. It's unfair, and the government shouldn't be doing it.
Let's turn to Scotland. You have said, and I quote, there should be a constitutional commission, quote, to renew the case for devolution. Is that a very urbane way of saying no referendum?
I don't think there should be another referendum. I don't think a further divisive referendum is the right way forward. But I do accept that the status quo isn't working. And I don't accept the argument that if the status quo isn't working, the next thing you do is go to a referendum. I think there are other things that you can do, other arguments that can be made in support of the United Kingdom. And so frankly, Andrew...
You said once the people of Scotland should decide this. If the people of Scotland decide this by voting for an SNP manifesto which says another independence referendum, what more can they do? What else should happen?
Look, Andrew, we're in the middle of a pandemic, probably the darkest moment of the pandemic, in Scotland as much as the rest of the United Kingdom. The idea that the only discussion we're having about Scotland is whether there should be a referendum when the health service is on its knees, the economy is really under strain. Lots of people and families are struggling in Scotland for their jobs and the future.
Boris Johnson told me it should be another 40 years.
Every time we talk about Scotland, the only question is, should there be another referendum?
Another 40 years before one?
Look, I heard the Prime Minister say that, and I don't agree with him on that. But I do think
sooner than that.
If you ask the people of Scotland what their priorities are, and this has been asked many times in the last few months, most of them understandably say the economy, jobs, health, public service, public services, not, and the idea that, you know. In the we're talking about whether the May election should go ahead, and we're talking about a referendum.
A one-word answer, final question. Have you spoken to Joe Biden yet?
No.
All right. Thank you very much indeed, Sir Keir Starmer. That's all from me. Thanks to my guests and to you for watching. I'll be back here at 9 a.m. next Sunday. But until then, goodbye.